Someone says something designed to make you flinch, and every part of you wants to answer back, to correct them, to make sure they understand exactly how wrong they are. And then you don't. You just look at them, and you let the sentence sit there in the air with nowhere to go. That's the moment most people never learn to survive, not because it's hard to stay quiet, but because staying quiet feels like losing, right up until you realize it's the opposite. Somewhere along the way you were taught that a fast comeback is strength, that if you don't respond, you've been beaten, that the person who talks last wins the room. It's a convincing story, and almost everyone believes it, which is exactly why almost everyone hands their power away without noticing. The people who actually understand how influence works learned something different a long time ago. They learned that the sharpest move in any conflict isn't the one you make, it's the one you don't. When you refuse to give someone the reaction they came for, something in them starts to come apart, quietly, privately, and they will never admit it happened. This isn't a video about being cold for the sake of being cold. It's about what happens when you finally stop feeding other people's egos with your attention, your explanations, your need to be understood in the moment. If you've ever bitten your tongue in a room full of people who expected you to explode, if you've ever walked away from a fight instead of finishing it, you already have a piece of what I'm about to describe. What you're missing is the rest of the picture, and that's what this video gives you. We live inside a machine built entirely on speed. Every notification wants an answer in seconds. Every argument wants a rebuttal before the other person has even finished their sentence. Somewhere in that constant pressure to respond, we forgot that a response is optional. Your attention became a kind of currency that other people expect you to spend the second they ask for it. And when you don't, they experience it as an injury, even though nothing was ever taken from them. That gap between what people expect and what you actually owe them is where real leverage lives. People are terrified of being ignored because it exposes the thing they work hardest to hide, which is how much they need to be seen. The co-worker who pushes and pushes for your reaction in a meeting, the family member who brings up old wounds at dinner hoping you'll snap, the ex who leaves a comment just provocative enough to bait a response. None of them are actually looking for a conversation. They're looking for proof that they still have power over how you feel. Refuse to hand that proof over, and you've already won something they can't take back. It helps to understand why this works on a mechanical level, not just as an idea you take on faith. Most conflict runs on a kind of feedback loop. One person pushes, gets a reaction, adjusts based on that reaction, and pushes again. Take the reaction out of the loop, and the whole mechanism stalls. There's nothing to adjust to, nothing to calibrate against, nothing telling the other person whether their last move landed or missed. That stall is uncomfortable for both people involved, but only one of them chose it, which means only one of them is prepared for what happens next. There's a strange kind of math at work here. Constant availability looks like generosity, but it usually functions as submission. The person who answers every call, replies to every message within a minute, and always has something to say the instant they're challenged, becomes completely predictable, and predictable people are easy to manage. The one who takes their time, who lets a message sit, who doesn't rush to explain themselves, introduces something the other person can't control: uncertainty. And uncertainty digs in deeper than almost anything you could say out loud. Think about an ordinary evening. A friend group is planning something without checking whether it works for you. And instead of pointing it out, arguing your case, making sure everyone knows you noticed, you simply say nothing and let the plan happen without you. That single decision, small as it looks from the outside, does more damage to the group's comfort than a complaint ever could. People start wondering. They start asking each other if something's wrong. Nobody wants to be the reason a room went quiet, and once they suspect they might be, the questions don't stop. Online, this plays out even faster. A post goes up and gets no reaction from the one person everyone assumed would comment. A story gets watched by everyone except the one name that used to show up first. Absence, when it's specific enough to notice, becomes louder than presence ever was. That's the part almost nobody plans for. You think being ignored online is invisible. It isn't. It's the most visible thing in the room, precisely because it's the one thing nobody can point to directly. An ego needs noise to confirm it exists. Take that noise away, and it doesn't just quiet down, it starts to unravel from the inside, because there's nothing left to argue with. Silence used deliberately isn't passive at all. It's closer to a scalpel than a wall. And the maddening part, for the person on the receiving end, is that there's no way to call you out for it. What exactly would they say? You didn't respond to something you were never obligated to respond to. That helplessness, the inability to even name what happened to them, is where the real damage sits. This has been understood for as long as people have competed for power. Commanders who refused to answer an enemy's taunts unsettled entire armies more than a counterattack would have. Diplomats who let a hostile letter go unanswered communicated more than pages of argument could. The refusal to engage was never a sign of weakness in those rooms. It was read correctly as the exact opposite. The person who can afford to ignore you is, by definition, operating from a position you can't reach. Weddings, funerals, and every other gathering that forces a whole family into the same room, whether anyone actually wants to be there or not, bring their own version of this. Someone makes a comment loaded with history, aimed at reopening something everyone thought was settled, and the whole table goes quiet, waiting to see if you'll take the bait. The people who understand leverage don't take it. They let the comment hang there unanswered, long enough that it becomes the speaker's problem instead of theirs, and they move the conversation forward as if nothing worth responding to was said at all. Everyone at that table remembers who stayed level-headed and who tried to start something. That memory outlasts the argument itself by years. A flat, unreadable response does the same work on a smaller scale. It tells someone, without a single wasted word, that whatever they just said didn't land the way they hoped it would. There's no argument to have with that. No opening, no way to escalate, because you haven't given them anything to escalate against. That kind of quiet closes a door more completely than any argument ever could, and it leaves an echo behind that keeps replaying in their head long after the conversation ended. This only works as long as it isn't just indifference dressed up as a strategy. There's a real difference between someone who has genuinely checked out and someone who is choosing, on purpose, not to spend their energy on a fight that isn't worth it. That choice takes actual discipline. Every instinct in your body will scream at you to defend yourself, to correct the record, to have the last word. Training yourself to resist that pull deliberately, again and again, is what separates a person operating with intention from a person who's simply gone numb. Once you start practicing this, you become something people can't quite categorize, and that unpredictability is its own kind of magnetism. When you stop explaining yourself, people fill the silence with their own theories, and every one of those theories gives you more weight in their imagination than a direct explanation ever could. What looks, from the outside, like withdrawal, is actually the opposite. You haven't disappeared. You've simply stopped auditioning for anyone's approval, and that alone is enough to make people pay closer attention than they used to. If any part of this is landing for you right now, this is exactly the ground I cover in the Complete Stoic System, the guide, the daily practice, and the overthinking reset, built around real situations, the argument you walk away from, the message you choose not to answer, the provocation you let pass without comment, and it breaks down how to use each one on purpose instead of by accident. Links below if you want to go deeper than what a single video can cover. When someone corners you and gets nothing back, the effect is almost unbearable for them, and here's why. They can't measure it, they can't argue with it, and they can't force it to end on their schedule. Every minute that passes without a reaction from you is a small, quiet confirmation that they don't control you the way they assumed they did. That realization builds slowly, and it builds precisely because you're not giving them anything to push against. Picture a relationship coming apart. One person expects the other side of the breakup to be loud, tearful, full of accusations they can respond to and defend themselves against. Instead, they get almost nothing. A short, even reply. No drama to react to. That absence of a fight is far more disorienting than the fight itself would have been, because there's nothing left for them to win. The pain in that kind of ending doesn't come from what was said. It comes from everything that was deliberately left unsaid. There's a version of this in the old Stoic texts worth borrowing. The idea that a closed door disturbs you less than the story you tell yourself about why it closed. Applied here, that means the sting of being ignored isn't really about the silence itself. It's about what the other person decides that silence means. You're not obligated to manage their interpretation. Holding your ground while someone tries to force a reaction out of you is one of the clearest, most practical demonstrations of that old idea you'll ever get to practice in real life. Each time you choose not to answer a provocation, you're doing something for yourself, not just to them. You're proving to your own nervous system that you can sit with tension without needing to discharge it immediately. That skill compounds. The next provocation gets a little easier to sit through. The one after that, easier still. Meanwhile, the people who are used to getting a reaction out of you start to notice that the old buttons don't work anymore. And that shift in the dynamic is permanent once it takes hold. There's something almost funny about what happens next. The people who used to get under your skin start working harder for less and less return. They escalate, hoping the old version of you is still in there somewhere, waiting to be provoked back into the game. You, meanwhile, are simply living your life, doing the things that actually matter to you, while they spend their energy trying to summon a reaction that isn't coming. That's not petty satisfaction. That's just what happens when one person stops playing a game, the other one never stopped playing. They will never say any of this out loud, obviously. Nobody walks up to you and says, "Your silence has been eating at me for weeks." But you'll see it in the way they suddenly show up somewhere they never used to go, in the way they bring up old conversations out of nowhere, in the way their tone shifts from dismissive to careful once they realize the old script isn't working anymore. That shift is the tell. It means the strategy is working exactly as it should. Let's get practical, because understanding this in theory doesn't help you in the middle of an actual argument. The first shift is timing. You don't have to answer immediately, ever. A message can wait an hour, a comment can wait until you've actually decided what, if anything, is worth saying. That gap between receiving something and responding to it is where all of your power lives, and most people give it away by default, without even realizing they have a choice. Take a family gathering where someone brings up an old grievance at the table, clearly hoping to get a rise out of you in front of everyone. Instead of defending yourself point by point, you let the comment sit there, unanswered, and you simply keep eating. Watch what happens to the room. The silence does more to expose the pettiness of the comment than any counter-argument could, because everyone at that table now has to sit with the awkwardness the other person created, and you refuse to rescue them from. At work, this shows up differently. A colleague interrupts you in a meeting, clearly trying to make a point at your expense. Instead of matching their energy, you pause, let the interruption hang there for a beat longer than is comfortable, and then continue exactly where you left off calmly as if nothing happened. That pause does more for your credibility in the room than winning the argument would have. People notice who stays composed under pressure, far more than they notice who wins a shouting match. In a relationship, the same principle looks like refusing to chase an explanation the other person isn't ready to give you. If a partner goes cold and starts pulling away, the instinct is to pursue, to ask what's wrong 5 times in one evening, to make yourself smaller, trying to close the distance. The stronger move is to let there be space, to keep living your own life fully in that space, and to let them come back to the conversation on their own terms, if they choose to. Chasing someone who has pulled back only confirms to them that they still hold the leverage. Standing still takes it back. This doesn't require you to become harsh or unreachable. You can be warm, present, and genuinely engaged with the people who deserve it, and still refuse to hand your calm over to the people who are testing you. In fact, the contrast is what makes this so effective. The people who watch you stay easygoing with everyone else, and completely unshakable with them specifically, understand the message without you ever having to say it out loud. Dating brings its own version of this test. Someone new starts pulling classic testing behavior, going quiet for a day to see if you'll spiral, sending mixed signals to watch how you respond. The instinct is to fix the ambiguity immediately, to ask directly where things stand, to manage the uncertainty out of existence. The stronger move is to let the ambiguity exist without needing to resolve it on someone else's timeline. If they come back with clarity on their own, you learn something real about them. If they don't, you've saved yourself months of trying to decode behavior that was never going to add up to anything solid. Either way, you come out ahead simply by refusing to chase clarity that wasn't being offered. Roommates and shared living spaces create a slower, quieter version of the same dynamic. Someone leaves dishes in the sink for the 3rd time this week, clearly testing how much you'll let slide before you say something. Instead of a passive-aggressive note or a blow-up argument, you simply clean your own space, keep your own standards, and let the discomfort of an obviously one-sided situation sit in the room until they address it themselves. 9 times out of 10 they do, faster than any confrontation would have gotten you there, because nobody enjoys being the only person who notices the double standard they're running. Every domain of your life gives you a place to practice this. In friendships, distance separates the people who actually value your presence from the ones who only valued your reactions. In your family, quiet steadiness interrupts patterns of guilt and manipulation that have worked for years simply because someone always took the bait before. At work, restraint means your opinion carries more weight precisely because you don't spend it on every minor provocation that crosses your desk. Each of these is a rehearsal for the next one. The pull toward this way of living is genuinely magnetic, and it isn't manufactured. It's a natural consequence of how people respond to composure. Someone who clearly isn't performing for approval reads as more secure than someone who's constantly explaining, justifying, defending. That security draws people in, even the ones who initially pushed against it hardest, because deep down most people are exhausted by their own need for validation and drawn to anyone who seems to have escaped that particular trap. Once you're actually living this way, the tests don't stop. They usually get harder before they get easier. People who are used to your old reactions will push, sometimes deliberately, sometimes without even realizing what they're doing, trying to find the version of you that used to respond the way they expected. Expect that. It's not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign the shift is real enough for other people to notice and resist. If you've ever managed people, you've probably already seen a version of this play out without naming it. A team member pushes back hard on a decision in front of the group, clearly hoping to put you on the defensive. The leaders who lose the room in that moment are the ones who match the intensity, who feel compelled to win the exchange in front of everyone watching. The ones who keep the room are the ones who let the pushback exist without needing to defeat it on the spot, who respond an hour later in private with something measured instead of something reactive. Everyone in that meeting remembers who stayed steady. Nobody remembers the specifics of who was technically right. Parenting runs on a similar mechanic, even though the stakes feel completely different. A child who's testing a boundary is often testing your reaction more than the boundary itself, looking for the exact pressure point that gets a rise out of you. Parents who explode at every test end up training their kids to keep testing because the explosion itself becomes the interesting part. Parents who hold a calm, consistent line without needing to win the moment emotionally end up with kids who stop testing sooner because there's nothing dramatic to provoke anymore. The lesson scales in both directions, up and down every relationship you have. Manipulation tends to escalate in predictable ways once the usual tactics stop working. First comes the direct provocation, the comment clearly designed to get a rise out of you. When that fails, it often turns into guilt, some version of if you actually cared, you'd respond. When that fails too, it can turn into distance and cold shoulders, an attempt to make you chase. Recognizing the pattern for what it is, a script that only works if you play your assigned part, makes it far easier to simply not pick up the cue. Notice too how much of this comes down to timing rather than personality. Plenty of naturally quiet people still hand their piece over constantly because staying quiet isn't the same as choosing your moments on purpose. And plenty of naturally talkative, expressive people have learned to apply exactly this kind of restraint in the specific situations that call for it, without it changing who they are the rest of the time. This was never about becoming a quieter person in general. It's about becoming a more deliberate one in the moments that actually matter. There's an old idea worth sitting with here. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is refusing to become like the person who wronged you. That line gets thrown around a lot, but the practical version of it is simpler than people make it sound. When someone tries to provoke a reaction out of you, matching their energy means you've adopted their approach as your own, even if you win the exchange. Staying composed isn't just about winning, it's about not letting someone else dictate what version of yourself shows up in the moment. Sitting through a provocation without reacting is, in a very literal sense, training. Your capacity to tolerate discomfort without needing to discharge it immediately grows every single time you practice it. the same way any other muscle grows under repeated, manageable strain. The provocations that used to knock you off balance for a full day start knocking you off balance for an hour, then a few minutes, then barely at all. That's not because you stopped caring. It's because you got stronger at carrying it. Breakups make this especially visible because they concentrate months of history into a handful of intense exchanges. The person who expects tears gets composure instead. The person who expects to be chased gets space instead. That mismatch between what they anticipated and what they actually receive is often more disorienting than the ending itself, and it tends to linger far longer than either person expects it to. By this point, if any of it is resonating, it's worth mentioning something. Tired of reacting the same way every time? The Complete Stoic System, Guide, plus Daily Practice, plus Overthinking Reset, all built to break the cycle. Discount for followers, link below. It also helps to know what escalation actually looks like in practice, because it rarely announces itself as escalation. It shows up as a sudden increase in contact from someone who'd gone quiet for weeks. It shows up as a comment that seems to come out of nowhere, aimed at a topic you haven't discussed in months. It shows up as someone bringing a third party into a conversation that used to be just between the two of you, hoping the added audience will succeed where direct pressure failed. Naming the pattern out loud to yourself, even silently, tends to strip most of its power away immediately. Escalation, when it happens, is usually a confession disguised as an attack. Someone doesn't ramp up their attempts to get a reaction out of you because your silence isn't working. They ramp up because it's working too well, and they're running out of tools. Recognizing escalation as evidence of your own composure, rather than as a sign you need to respond harder, changes how it lands on you completely. Emotional composure under pressure isn't the same thing as emotional numbness, even though from the outside they can look similar. Numbness is the absence of feeling. Composure is feeling everything and choosing deliberately what to do with it. That distinction matters, because the goal here was never to stop feeling anything when someone tries to provoke you. The goal is to stop letting the feeling dictate the next move before you've had a chance to choose one. Something physical happens here too, and people rarely talk about it. When you're mid-provocation and you feel your pulse pick up, your jaw tighten, the urge to speak building in your chest, that's the exact moment the outcome gets decided. Not in what you say next, but in whether you let 3 full seconds pass before you say anything at all. That pause is small enough that nobody else in the room notices it happening, but it's the entire mechanism. People who seem naturally unshakable under pressure aren't feeling less than everyone else. They've simply built the habit of inserting that pause automatically until it stopped requiring conscious effort. An unanswered provocation deepens something the other person can't quite name, and it isn't really about you specifically anymore at that point. It's about the discomfort of realizing they no longer have a reliable way to affect you, which for some people is one of the most destabilizing realizations they can have about another person. You're not trying to cause that. It's simply a side effect of no longer being reachable in the way you used to be. The examples pile up once you start noticing them. The colleague who keeps pushing for a reaction in meetings eventually gives up when it stops producing anything. The ex who keeps testing the waters with occasional messages eventually stops when the replies, if they come at all, stay brief and unbothered. The family member who used guilt as leverage for years finds that leverage quietly stops working, without a single confrontation ever taking place. In every case, the change wasn't announced. It was simply demonstrated over and over until it became obvious. This same instinct shows up somewhere you wouldn't expect it, which is how it changes the way you handle praise and criticism you didn't ask for. Someone offers an opinion about a decision you've already made, uninvited, expecting you to either defend it or fold under the pressure of their disapproval. The person who's built this skill does neither. They simply acknowledge the opinion exists, without treating it as something that requires a verdict from them right now. Not every comment needs a rebuttal. Not every piece of unsolicited feedback needs to be absorbed or argued against on the spot. Sometimes the strongest response really is just letting it exist as someone else's opinion and moving forward with your own decision intact. Think about how differently two people can walk out of the exact same argument. One spends the rest of the day replaying every line, drafting comebacks they wish they'd said, still fighting a battle that technically ended hours ago. The other one simply moved on the moment the conversation did, because they never handed their piece over to begin with. The difference between those two people isn't intelligence or even confidence in the traditional sense. It's whether they've trained themselves to let a moment end when it's actually over, instead of keeping it alive out of habit. Every one of these small moments of restraint adds up to something bigger than the sum of its parts. Your discipline gets sharper, your sense of your own resilience gets more solid, because you've actually tested it under real pressure, instead of just believing it about yourself in the abstract. And your self-respect stops depending on whether other people approve of how you're handling things, because you've watched yourself hold steady enough times to trust it without needing outside confirmation anymore. Military history offers a clean example of this. A general who, after winning a decisive battle, refused to celebrate publicly or gloat in front of the defeated side's messengers. His own officers pushed him to make a show of it, to humiliate the losing side while he had the chance. He declined, and history remembers that restraint far more clearly than it remembers the details of the battle itself, because the restraint was the rarer, harder thing to pull off. Power that doesn't need an audience tends to outlast power that does. Eventually, this stops feeling like a technique you're deploying and starts feeling like who you actually are. That's the real shift, the one that matters more than any single interaction. In the beginning, staying quiet under pressure takes visible effort. You can feel yourself choosing it in real time. Later, it stops requiring a choice at all. It becomes the way you naturally move through friction. The same way someone who's trained for years doesn't think about their form anymore. They just move that way. At that point, the steadiness you've built isn't a strategy for handling other people. It's simply how you exist in the world. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard, because the people around you have already learned that when you do speak, it means something. Your quiet has developed a kind of weight that loud people spend years trying and failing to earn through volume alone. It's worth being honest about the timeline here, because nobody builds this overnight, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The first few times you hold back a reaction, it will feel unnatural, almost unbearable, like you're swallowing something that needs to come out. That discomfort is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's the exact sensation of an old habit losing its grip on you. Give it a few weeks of consistent practice, and the discomfort starts to fade. Give it a few months and it becomes difficult to remember why you ever felt the need to respond to everything in the first place. This shift is also, in its own quiet way, a form of justice, even if that's not the point of it. The people who spent years assuming they could provoke a reaction out of you whenever they wanted, eventually have to sit with the discomfort of realizing that dynamic is gone and isn't coming back. You didn't take anything from them directly. You simply stopped supplying something they'd come to depend on without ever asking whether they were entitled to it in the first place. Effectiveness here doesn't require drama. In fact, the less dramatic it looks from the outside, the more it tends to work. A calm response to chaos, a short reply to a long, loaded message, a pause before you speak that lets everyone in the room feel the weight of what was just said without you having to add anything to it. These aren't grand gestures. They're small, consistent choices that accumulate into something people around you start to respect, without fully understanding why. Watch for a particular kind of test that shows up once people realize the old approach isn't working anymore, worth naming, so you recognize it when it happens. Instead of provoking you directly, they start performing for an audience, telling a version of events to mutual friends or co-workers designed to paint you as the unreasonable one, hoping the social pressure will do what direct provocation couldn't. This one stings differently because it feels unfair in a way a direct insult doesn't. The instinct is to correct the record loudly, to make sure everyone hears your side. Resist that instinct anyway. People who know you tend to notice the gap between the story being told and the person they've actually experienced. And that gap does more work over time than any defense you could mount in the moment. Loud corrections rarely change anyone's mind. Consistent behavior observed over months changes almost everyone's. A quieter version of this test happens with nobody else in the room at all. The private argument you keep having with someone who isn't there, rebuilding the same 3 sentences you never got to say out loud until they're sharper than anything you'd have actually said in the moment. That rehearsal feels productive in the moment, like you're preparing for next time, but it's actually the opposite of what you've been practicing. It's handing the argument a second life it doesn't deserve, inside your own head, where nobody's even listening anymore. Catching yourself mid-rehearsal and simply closing that loop, on purpose, is one of the harder skills covered here, and one of the ones that pays off the fastest once you've built it. Old patterns leave a mark on people, even when nothing dramatic ever happens on the surface. Someone who's used to provoking you and getting nothing carries that unresolved tension somewhere, whether they ever admit it or not. You're not responsible for managing that discomfort for them. Your job was never to make sure everyone around you feels resolved. It was to make sure you're not spending your own energy trying to force a resolution that was never yours to force in the first place. People sometimes worry that living this way will make them harder to know, harder to reach, less warm to the people who actually matter to them. In practice, the opposite tends to happen. When you're not spending your energy managing every provocation that crosses your path, you have far more of it left over for the relationships that are actually worth investing in. The friend who calls at midnight because something genuinely fell apart still gets your full attention. The partner who wants to talk through something real still gets honesty and presence, not distance. What disappears isn't warmth. It's the compulsive need to prove yourself to people who are never going to be satisfied no matter what you gave them. What you're left with after enough practice is something that looks a lot like freedom, because in a real sense, that's exactly what it is. You're no longer at the mercy of whoever happens to say the most provocative thing in the room that day. Your peace of mind stopped being a resource other people could drain on demand. That's not coldness. That's the most practical form of self-respect there is, and it took actual work to build. It's worth saying plainly that none of this is about becoming unreachable to people who genuinely deserve an answer from you. There's a real difference between a provocation designed to destabilize you and an honest question asked by someone who actually cares about the answer. Confusing the two and going quiet on people who deserve better from you isn't strength, it's just a different kind of overcorrection. The whole point of building this skill is discernment, knowing which moments call for restraint and which ones call for genuine, open engagement. Anyone can go silent indiscriminately. The harder, more valuable skill is knowing the difference. If you've made it this far, you already have more of this than you had 20 minutes ago, and that's worth something on its own. But nodding along to an idea in a video and actually holding your ground the next time someone's in your face are not the same muscle, and the Complete Stoic System was built to train the second one specifically. It walks through the exact situations covered here, the argument, the guilt trip, the cold shoulder, and gives you language and structure for handling each one in the moment instead of only afterward, once the moment has already passed you by. Links below if you want to keep building on what you just watched. This doesn't happen on the timeline of a single video, and that's worth saying honestly, instead of promising you a shortcut that doesn't exist. What actually changes things is repetition, the same handful of decisions made consistently over months, not a single dramatic moment of resolve. The people who get the most out of this aren't the ones who understood it fastest. They're the ones who kept coming back to it, video after video, situation after situation, until the discipline stopped being something they had to think about at all. There's more of this waiting here whenever the next provocation shows up, not as a promise, just as a fact about where the channel already lives. You don't need the last word to win a conversation. You never did. What you need is the discipline to let a moment pass without needing to control how it ends, and once you've practiced that enough times for it to become automatic, you'll find that most of the conflicts that used to consume entire days now barely register at all. Everything else tends to follow from there.